Hello, my friends. This is a video essay on Game of Thrones titled How Game of Thrones is Subversive. It is a common cliche among Game of Thrones fan reviews to refer to the series, both the books and the TV show, as being, quote, subversive, but not in the sense I am about to explain. What these fans are referring to is the idea that Game of Thrones subverts expectations related to traditional themes and ideas in fantasy writing, going back to Tolkien. The subversion that I am referring to, however, is social, psychological, and most importantly, moral. In fact, I think Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire amounts to nothing less than a psyop against the mostly white consumers of the fantasy genre, and I will explain very clearly why and how. Whether George R.R. Martin is himself a useful idiot or a purposeful agent of the hidden hand controlling society is an open question. What is not a matter of debate, however, is that his subversive and psychologically destructive stories have been promoted heavily by establishment media outlets and producers. I will say more about that later, but for now, let us consider what makes Game of Thrones such a damaging psyop. I recently watched a number of interviews with George Martin, and one statement he made in particular stuck out and made me realize what a terrible goblin this man was. He said that his intention was to inspire fear in his audience.
My God, I really don't know what's going to happen in this book. Anyone can die. And it became so much more exciting at that point because anyone could die, the peril was real. And that's the feeling I want my readers to have, that if you're going to enter...
Fear is the feeling you want your readers to have. Yeah.
Yes, actually, in a word, if you're going to write about fearful situations, I want you to have fear.
I want you to have fear, and the right kind of fear. And that's the feeling I want my readers to have. My God, I really don't know what's going to happen. Anyone can die.
And that's the feeling I want my readers to have, that if you're going to enter...
Fear is the feeling you want your readers to have. Yeah.
Yes, actually, and that's the feeling I want my readers to have. The peril was real. It doesn't matter if you're the hero. I think everybody who died in any war thought they were the hero right till the moment that the bullet blew off the top of their skull.
He says, to paraphrase, I want people to have fear, and the right kind of fear. Not the kind of fear of a roller coaster ride, because people know they'll get off in 3 minutes and be fine. That's more like the rush of a thrill. I want them to feel the kind of fear like they're walking alone in a bad neighborhood, and suddenly you hear footsteps behind you, and you see some people coming, and you don't know who the hell they are. After hearing this, my first thought was, what the fuck? Is Martin trying to be some kind of literary terrorist? By the way, in this same interview, which I will link below, Martin gives a pathetic critique of Tolkien, saying things like, Gandalf should have stayed dead. His return to life undercut the power of that moment, which his sick audience laughed at and applauded. And he also said, I thought Frodo was dead when Shelob stung him, and in that moment, I thought Tolkien had earned his stripes with me. My God, I really don't know what's going to happen in this book. Anybody can die. Has a more depraved mind ever existed? Simply put, he wants his audience to be consumed by this cheap fear that anybody can die and that literature is not supposed to provide good moral inspiration. This is my translation of Martin for you. Don't bother being a hero. It doesn't matter how good your cause is. Don't have courage. Don't feel righteous anger in the face of danger. Don't feel as though the gods are protecting you and that you are invincible like Aragorn or Gandalf. Instead, feel like you might die. Like anybody could die at any moment. In other words, feel like the tiny, fat, scared little goblin that Martin actually is. I'm actually disgusted that Martin says Tolkien was an influence on him, and even more disgusted that Martin is referred to as the American Tolkien. If anything, Martin is the anti-Tolkien. If you've ever read Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, which explains Tolkien's philosophy of fantasy literature, he wants to offer three main things to his readers with his fantasy works: recovery, escape, and consolation. His stories offer uplifting hope and increased strength, as well as increased faith in oneself and in the power to be good and to triumph over the bad. Martin offers only the opposite in the guise of authenticity, as if it is more authentic to be afraid than to be courageous, or as if it is more authentic to compromise your moral values than to be morally righteous. And that takes me to my next point. It's not just the fear of death that Martin's books inculcates in his readers. It inspires generalized fear and anxiety about oneself and others by presenting a world where just about all of the characters, and especially the most successful, quote-unquote, ones, are morally corrupt, manipulative, have hidden ulterior motives, and constantly plot against each other in order to get ahead. It generally sows distrust and undermines the very possibility of moral decency. Everyone, according to Martin's philosophy and the inherent philosophy of his viewers, are morally corrupted somehow. Martin has stated that he follows William Faulkner's motto, quote, "The only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself." Faulkner, by the way, is another likely spook, being from a very wealthy railroad family. And this has been said to mean that, quote, "every person has the potential to be an angel or a demon, and that everyone has great good and great evil in them, and that we're all morally corrupt somehow, and that just accepting this it's just being realistic." But what does this teach us about ourselves? How can we think of ourselves as good or righteous people if we are to simply accept the corrupt moral of Martin's story? What are we to think of others if we cannot see them as being basically good or bad? All good judgment goes right out the window in this type of thinking, and it undermines our ability to judge honorably when we have to. It introduces doubt and undermines our faith in ourselves and in others. This is especially true when the other characters presented as having honor and following a moral code, like Ned Stark, are brutally killed for it, while characters that lack all scruples, like the Lannisters or Littlefinger, last the longest and get written sympathetically. This is especially true for the character Varys, a bald eunuch who acts almost exclusively through guile and deceit, but is written so that he is supposed to be a true champion of the people. This series is written explicitly to confuse right and wrong, and this muddying of the moral waters is seen by the audience as being really highly intellectual and relatable stuff. Read any online post from a Game of Thrones fan about the, quote, moral ambiguity or the realpolitik of the series to see how they think that Ned Stark is, quote, painfully honorable, while someone like Tywin Lannister is very relatable because of how conniving and morally corrupt he is. The more we relish stories like this, the more they shape our perspective on the world, and the more the viewer or the reader comes to believe things like that, quote, being honorable is just old and stuffy, and it gets you nowhere. I want to be more like a Lannister and do whatever I must to get ahead. or somebody else will just pull one over on me. Moral codes and honor are weak in the face of ruthless scoundrels who don't play by the rules, so screw the rules. There are no rules in life. It is a well-known psychological fact that the stories that we ingest in media shape our perspectives on the world more than rational facts or statistics. This has been studied in the case of acts of terrorism in particular. While we are more likely to die in mundane ways, people are more likely to fear dying in a terrorist attack because of the immense news coverage terrorism is given. And this is because the more we read emotionally compelling stories about something, the more it sticks in us psychologically. Therefore, reading or watching a series like Game of Thrones produces in the viewer a sense that anybody, including themselves, could be as manipulative, morally corrupt, and deceitful as the characters from the book, which only serves to reinforce this negative behavior and undermine social trust. And undermining social trust is a textbook example of the divide and rule strategy of the corrupt elite today. Machiavelli, in Book 6 of The Art of War, said, quote, "A captain should endeavor with every art to divide the forces of the enemy." Machiavelli advises that this act be achieved by making men suspicious of those in whom he trusted. A public that consumes books with these implicit moral lessons, that everybody is manipulative and deceitful, nobody is really good, but everybody is, quote, morally ambiguous, and that heroes with honor just get killed off the soonest, while the most cunning and Machiavellian gain the most. This sort of public has no chance in any cohesiveness. They are divided, every man against every man. It is impossible for such a public to have enough trust in each other to band together to mount any effective resistance against the corrupt elites that rule over them. And that's why those exact elites are promoting this series so much. This is exactly the opposite of what Tolkien intended for his audience with Lord of the Rings. He wanted them to have a renewed faith in the power of goodness. Every time I read Lord of the Rings, I am refreshed in my inspiration to be as loyal as Samwise Gamgee, as wise and beneficent as Gandalf, or as honorable and courageous as Aragorn. I am renewed in my faith of beauty and goodness, triumphing over ugliness and evil, and the power of a trusted fellowship where each friend can totally and completely rely on all the rest in the face of whatever difficulties may come. Nothing like this even remotely occurs in Martin's books. And Martin is like a fat waddling goblin or orc, more than a stern-faced man of the north with shining gray eyes that conceal nothing. Martin is not even like a kindly, simple hobbit. He is a cackling, waddling, arrogant bit of ugliness, and that's all he can write. Is Martin's writing authentic to the modern world? Well, perhaps in a sense, it does match its ugliness and moral corruption quite well. But in his On Fairy Stories, Tolkien wrote that this is exactly what fantasy literature is meant to help us escape and recover from. Even back in Tolkien's time, he was criticized for being a childish escapist and not portraying, quote, real life. And Tolkien consciously reacted against that, choosing instead to give literature that refreshes us and helps us to, quote, regain a clear view of things, quote, as we are or were meant to see them. Tolkien did not want his stories to merely reflect and reinforce the corrupt world we are living in, but instead to help us imagine something better. And imagining something better is the first step toward making it a reality. If we can't even imagine a better world, how could it ever be brought into being? I will end this section with a quote from On Fairy Stories that shows Tolkien's thoughts here quite clearly. Martin does not deserve the name Tolkien, and I am almost certain that Tolkien would be disgusted by Martin's popularity and resent any comparison to him. Anyway, here's the quote. But there are other and more profound escapisms that have always appeared in fairy tale and legend. There are other things more grim and terrible to fly from than the noise, stench, ruthlessness, and extravagance of the internal combustion engine. There are hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death. And even when men are not facing hard things such as these, there are ancient limitations from which fairy stories offer a sort of escape, and old ambitions and desires touching the very roots of fantasy, to which they offer a kind of satisfaction and consolation. Let us now return to the question of who these elites are that are promoting this psyop. The most obvious is the HBO producer David Benioff. He is Jewish, and his father was the former head of Goldman Sachs Financial Bank. Benioff went to the Ivy League school, Dartmouth, where he was a member of the secret society called the Sphinx Club. This man has establishment spook written all over him. Daniel Weiss, his co-producer, is also Jewish, but has less of an obvious spook history, besides being involved in Holly Jew productions for a long time. And when you're working with a spook like Benioff, you get to be counted as one yourself. Martin himself, though, is a tougher nut to crack. He also has Ashkenazi heritage, and his biography is full of hard-to-imagine claims. One is that he claims to have been raised by a poor dock worker and lived in government project housing, but then went on to attend Northwestern University, a very expensive school that might as well be Ivy League, except that it's in Chicago. Another fact is that he somehow avoided the Vietnam draft as a conscientious objector and served for Vista instead, which seems like an intelligence front. My guess at the moment would be that Martin did not write the books on his own, although his small, rotten soul may be at the core of them. I would guess that they were written with him leading a committee of Intel-hired spooks. But making a case for this is beyond the scope of this video. For now, all I can do is give you my hunch. Perhaps I'll make one dedicated to Martin and his connections if there is enough interest. What is obvious is that Martin's work is heavily promoted by the establishment, and that his work has psychological effects that would be favorable for the corrupt, hidden elite that controls Europe and America. Thank you for watching.